Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the Great Debate. And we're fortunate to have with us to talk about the Great Debate Professor Dr. AAl-Hadid, formerly from Tennessee State University. And of course, Dr. AAl-Hadid, you've been with us many, many times. And I think that for most of our audience, you really need no introduction, literally. But in case there might be a few people who might not have seen you within this context before, let's have you to give us some information about your background, your education, and some of the experiences before becoming involved with the topic, the Great Debate this morning. Then we'll talk about, by the end of at that time, it should be time for the first commercial break, and then we'll get into the second segment dealing almost exclusively with the Great Debate, as well as that last 10-minute segment. Let's do it from that perspective.
Well, I would like to start with the idea that I'm originally from Montgomery, Alabama, and my consciousness in terms of becoming aware of social issues and culture came about by participating in the civil rights movement there in Montgomery. I came of age between the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965. And it was through that experience that I came to understand injustice. I came to understand the nature of the struggle. In fact, it led me to understanding how you take basic Christian principles and apply them to social change when I was a student there at Alabama State. I left Alabama State and went out on the West Coast, and that took me to another level. At that point, I became in contact more with people, nationalistic thinking and more Islamic thinking. So out of that experience, I moved over and became Muslim. I was a missionary Baptist and I became Muslim. Went to Africa, traveled extensively through Africa, mainly in Kenya, East Africa, Nigeria and West Africa, and some other countries. And I made the pilgrimage to Mecca in 1969 and finished my doctorate, came to Tennessee State in 73. And I stayed at TSU for 35 years. And then I did a brief period as a principal of a local Islamic school, the Nashville International Academy. And so that's pretty much my academic and activist resume.
So in the real sense, Dr. AAl-Hadid, you've been involved in some way, one way or the other, dealing with civil rights, the activities involved in human rights and et cetera, almost all of your life. Is that right?
Yeah, I was born and bred and
struggled with that. And I think, as you said, between what the bus boycott,
Montgomery bus boycott,
the
55,
Selma in 65,
65, right.
That decade, which was a powerful decade in the history of the United States, not only in the history of black folks in the United States, but in the history of the United States in a real sense, especially dealing with the suffrage. And I think that that's still one of the most important things that we can talk about today, and we'll have an opportunity to talk about that. But in a real sense, this is basically what we wanted to do, to sort of get that information. And as we said, you've been with us on many, many occasions, and each time we get the same kind of basic information, but there are some other things that we really didn't pull out during that first time. And so you made the whole round in a real sense, and we're certainly delighted to have you here to talk about what we consider to be one of the most important topics, and that's the Great Debate. We've got about a minute and a half before this segment ends. Why don't you sort of give us an overview of what do we mean really when we talk about the Great Debate?
Well, as we defined it at Tennessee State, the Great Debate is a culture and intellectual forum within which we debated contemporary social issues. The goal was to try to find a synthesis between the philosophies and the theology of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and try to find where they came together in common unity and harmony. Because historically, a lot of people felt that they were so different that they didn't have anything in common, but as they progressed in the struggle, you find that they start to converge and they came closer together. So our goal in the Great Debate was try to figure out how can you unify these two philosophies, these two theologies, and then apply those principles to contemporary social issues.
And you've also, I think, started to apply the Great Debate to individuals or various personalities, because I recall that at one time we did a great debate on the President Barack Obama, and the Great Debate. And I think that that was one of the most popular shows that we've had dealing with President Obama and the Great Debate. Right. And so what we're going to do, we're going to take our first commercial break, excuse me, and then we'll come back and we'll pick up at that time, beginning with the Great Debate. Mm-hmm. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for the morning. We're talking to Dr. Al-Hadid, who is a retired professor from Tennessee State University, and he's given us some information in reference to the Great Debate. Professor Al-Hadid, let's see if we can pick up where we left off during the first segment and have you to start talking about the Great Debate itself. Mm-hmm.
I like to put the Great Debate in some historical context. I see it in three stages. One is what I would call the archetypical Great Debate, and that was the tension between those leaders, primarily who were doing slavery, who wanted to repatriate back to Africa, and then another group of people who wanted to assimilate into American society. So out of those who wanted to repatriate, you got the establishment of the country of Liberia on about the time of the Civil War. And for those that wanted to repatriate after the American Revolution, you got the establishment of Sierra Leone. Mm-hmm. So there were actually two colonies established from ex-slaves from America, Sierra Leone during the period of the American Revolution, and then you had Liberia during the period of the Civil War. And you had other people who felt that they didn't leave anything in Africa, didn't want to go back. So they would say, as soon as we're free, we're going to assimilate into America. Well, when slavery ended, in 1865, there was the illusion of assimilation, but the reality of Jim Crow. So out of that dialectic came another great debate, and that great debate was between what we might call separation and integration. And you had people who wanted to take those positions. And this one I would call the prototypical great debate. And that was the great debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois.
Most of us know that debate.
That's the most familiar one. Du Bois was, and they both dealt with educational institutions. Du Bois pushed a liberal arts agenda for the private schools, because he was a graduate of Fisk University. And Booker T. Washington pushed more or less an agenda of self-determination. Lifting yourself up by your own bootstraps. And he developed it based on the A&I model, agricultural and industrial. So out of that came, out of his vision came a lot of your land grant schools like Tennessee State University, Arkansas A&M, Florida A&M, and so forth. So Booker T. Washington's philosophy was more of a land grant philosophy, where development was based on the land and agriculture, and Du Bois's philosophy was more liberal arts. And so he wanted people to become scholars, intellectuals, and study the classics. And so they clashed, you know, and Du Bois is probably best known for his role in being one of the founders of the NAACP, and then later on being a person who created the early Pan-African movements. He did 5 Pan-African movements, so he went from the assimilation with NAACP, then he became a Pan-Africanist, a socialist, and finally he left the country and repatriated himself to Ghana, where he was a guest there of Kwame Nkrumah, the first African head of state there in Ghana. Now, of course, with Booker T. Washington's legacy, which was one of economic self-sufficiency and economic self-determination, his argument was picked up by Marcus Garvey. As a matter of fact, when Garvey came from Jamaica, he said that of all of the leaders in America, Booker T. Washington was the only one that had any sense, because he was the one who was trying to understand white supremacy and apartheid the way it was. So Garvey picked it up in 1916, and then he got accused of mail fraud and was put in prison in Atlanta. But before that happened, he organized one of the largest movements in the history of our people. I think he mobilized about 6 million people as a part of his organization, Universal Negro Improvement Association. When Garvey was taken off the scene in 1928, on the heels of Garvey came another man actually two people. One was Noble Drew Ali with the Moorish Science Temple, and then the other one was Farad Muhammad, who came in 1930. And so what they did, you went from Booker T. Washington to Marcus Garvey, and from that, then the Islamic nationalism came out in those two movements, the Moorish Science Temple, Noble Drew Ali, and then the Nation of Islam with Farad Muhammad, and later Elijah Muhammad, who picked it up from Farad Muhammad.
That's interesting.
Yes, and then of course with the civil rights movement, then out of that came, you know, Martin Luther King and A. Philip Randolph with the Pulling the Cars Porter. So you had these two movements, and eventually we come to the point where Malcolm and Martin come on the scene in the mid 1950s. Malcolm being associated with his Mosque No. 7 in Harlem, and Martin Luther King coming on the stage at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, and then later he went to Ebenezer there in Atlanta. So when those two men came on the scene, the gap between the two was getting narrower and smaller. So we started out with the two extremes, either assimilate here as a domestic strategy or repatriate back to Africa. Most people didn't want that. So now you deal with integration versus separation. And then in the case of Martin and Malcolm, it was separation versus integration. But Elijah Muhammad was not like Marcus Garvey. He did not necessarily want to go back to Africa. He was pushing more an idea of reparations. He wanted the United States government to give African Americans some arable states in the South mainly, 2 or 3 states, so that it could develop a nation within a nation. Of course, that was utopian thinking because, you know, a civil war was fought when the Southerners broke away from the Union, but that, you know, never happened. So he was pushing a philosophy of reparation for the pain and suffering of slavery, separation from whites because they didn't want to integrate, and then self-determination, economic self-determination. So he was more or less embraced Booker T. Washington economic agenda. When Martin Luther King came along, the dominant civil rights movement was the NAACP, and of course A. Philip Randolph with the labor movement, the Pullman Car Porters. And so you had a labor agenda with A. Philip Randolph, and then you had Rel Wilkins with the NAACP.